We don't have an existential threat today. What can they do? Well, they're an economy of force organization. They can do lots of things. They can manipulate conditions. El Salvador is now being held up as an example of the effectiveness of Army Special Forces because we never had more than 50 uniformed advisors with the El Salvadoran military. And we managed to defeat a leftist insurgency. And we were very proud of ourselves. But that leftist insurgency then went into politics. They just won the election in El Salvador, and one wonders what will happen now. My point is that you have to scale back your expectations of what you can reasonably achieve. But special operations forces can be very helpful, and they can influence things in positive ways. But they are not, in and of themselves alone, decisive strategically. Next slide. So what can we say about the use of general purpose forces? We're talking about conventional forces. Well, if we go to Iraq, we see that by using conventional forces to move into, occupy a country with, I guess, the gross domestic output of Fairfax County, Virginia, and several million unhappy Muslim Arabs who absolutely revile large numbers of Christian Europeans in U.S. or British uniform in their country, that this has become a very expensive and in many ways self-defeating affair. Costs us $1 trillion over 6 years. Probably not a good idea to repeat that, particularly because if you have to take casualties under these kinds of circumstances, the American people are not very happy about it. They don't pay too much attention to the money that vanishes, but they're not going to support large numbers of casualties in these things where they don't see any strategic interest that is compelling or vital. So what about winning? We hear a lot, well, we've got to win in Iraq. We've got to win in Afghanistan. What does winning mean? Are we going to have a meeting on the battleship Missouri, summon the representatives and end it? No. These people that we're dealing with are somewhere between the 13th century and the 17th. There is no organized structure. There are no organized armies, navies, air forces. There are no thriving cities out there producing military capability. There are millions and millions of people who are mired internally in a struggle with modernization. And they have serious cultural obstacles to deal with on the road to that modernization. These things have almost nothing at all to do with us. So the winning construct is not there. And it brings you back to the notion of your special operations forces. They can go in and for temporary periods work with people that share an interest with us, but we cannot fundamentally alter these societies, these cultures, these nations, and transform them into something they don't have the capacity to become. In Afghanistan, we are currently repeating a very serious mistake. I think we've done it in Iraq, but now in Afghanistan it's potentially more serious because of the proximity of Pakistan, because you actually have to see Pakistan and Afghanistan as one country. Sort of dismiss the border, it's meaningless. LBJ and his government thought that with enough money, enough time, enough goodwill, and enough troops, you could turn Vietnam into some thriving Western-style state. It was an utter and complete failure. So if large-scale commitments to these general-purpose forces is not the answer, what do we do? Next slide. Well, the first bullet's very important. Just as the people of Philadelphia do not want to be occupied by the Egyptian army, there is no one in the Muslim world, and for that matter, anywhere else in Asia, Africa, or the Middle East, or Latin America, who is going to welcome hundreds of thousands of U.S. Marines and soldiers with open arms. It's not going to happen. It doesn't make any difference if what you are bringing is something better, or what you can do for them is better. They don't want you in the country. Non-Europeans will not accept the dominance of American and European powers, period. They will ultimately fight you or exploit you for whatever they can get. Economy of force is the principle that you've got to apply. Now, keep something in mind. When you go to war, your objective in war is not to spend as much money as possible, or to lose as many lives as possible, or to drag it out as long as possible. After the Second World War, there was a lot of criticism leveled at FDR and Truman, and ultimately General Eisenhower and others, because of the way the Second World War ended. But FDR and Truman both understood the criticality of getting back to a peacetime situation in order to restore the economic stability to the United States and keep building its prosperity. We took the best deal we could get and accepted the reality that it would be a long time before our friends on the opposite side in the Soviet Union would change and adapt. What about Afghanistan? What should we do? Well, what about limiting our involvement to very modest temporary alliances with those that work with us so that we can attack those people that we think are the enemy that we're interested in destroying? Because the other lesson we've gotten from Iraq is that 90% of the people you're dealing with are not your enemy at all. Well, they don't want you in the country, but they're not necessarily your enemy either. So the objective is not to make more enemies. And what we did for years in Iraq is successfully generate more enemies. American experience in El Salvador that I mentioned before is very illuminating, but again, scale back your expectations. You may achieve temporary conditions that are favorable to you, but all of these nations have cultures that are far older than ours. They may not be particularly conducive to modernization in our sense, but these cultures have evolved over thousands of years. The notion that we're going to change this underlying foundation and impose some new political superstructure in society is delusional. Next slide. So here are some thoughts for your consideration as future great captains of the armed forces. First one is very important. You don't want to spend as much blood and treasure as possible. You certainly don't want to spend $1 trillion in a place like Iraq that cannot absorb the investment. Impossible. It's just gone. When you start talking about irregulars, which is the new word for the people that we think we want to fight, the tribesmen, the clansmen, whatever you want to call them, the idea is to get them to bleed, to expend their resources, not ours, to essentially fight them on the cheap. Because we know unless we're willing to kill all of them, Genghis Khan style, we're not going to change anything. They are going to have to evolve on their own. We're only going to influence things on the margins. We can and should avoid direct conflict in the 21st century. There's a reason we can avoid most conflicts. Because we are a large island. And we, in most cases, are remote from the future great struggles that loom ahead of us on the Eurasian landmass in Africa. Why? Because we don't have to engage in these things. Imagine a world in 25 years where the unthinkable occurs, where the Japanese and the Koreans, who are now reunited into one country, are allied with each other. China is disintegrated, fragmented. The Japanese and the Koreans make the decision to seize Siberia. Why? For its natural resources, to exploit it. The Russian birth rate has continued to fall. Russia is poor, and Russia lacks the military power to keep them out. Should we involve ourselves in a war to stop the Japanese and the Koreans from exploiting Siberia? I don't think so. But think about these kinds of conflicts that loom down the line that are going to be very important, and they're going to involve adversaries who are very powerful. Indo-Pakistani war, if that happened tomorrow morning, and it could, by the way, and nuclear weapons were used, and they would be, I suspect, if there were an Indo-Pakistani conflict, that would change everyone's outlook. Who here would talk about fourth-generation war or counterinsurgency if nuclear warheads are being lobbed back and forth between the Indians and the Pakistanis? It's gone. It's over with. What about our assumptions about the way we organize our general purpose forces? How many surface ships we have versus how many attack submarines? What about large ground combat formations and how they should be organized? Remember that criticality of mobility and dispersion. How do you achieve that? Do you achieve it with a helicopter if you're operating on a battlefield with WMD? Probably not. But a tracked armored platform becomes very important. General MacArthur. You've heard of him. He's a cousin, by the way. General MacArthur was Chief of Staff of the Army in 1929. And in the 1920s, we intervened in Haiti. We intervened in Nicaragua, intervened in a number of different places. Actually went back into Cuba. I think it was the third time we'd occupied Cuba, transforming them into a modern Western-style democracy. But General MacArthur did not regard these events as a justification or rationale for reorienting the United States